Our last segment took a look at rockabilly and talked about how it was one element in the evolution of rock and roll. And we were talking about the year 1954, and on this segment we're going to stick with the year 1954 because in 1954, one of sort of the very first official rock and roll song was released, and that song, of course, was Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and His Comets. Now, this is so interesting because Rock Around the Clock is really like this weird patchwork quilt of all of the different things that made up rock, and you can hear them all happening in this one song, and that's why I just love this song. So you got all kinds of stuff. First of all, we talked about rhythm and blues. Well, in Bill Haley and His Comets, you had like a honkin' tenor saxophone that was reminiscent of the rhythm and blues bands of the 1940s and 50s. You talk about country and rockabilly being part of rock and roll. Well, Bill Haley and His Comets had a slapping bass player who had a killing slap sound. They also had a pedal steel player. So that comes from country music. And Bill Haley himself was a former country singer, and he played acoustic guitar like many former country singers. And we also talked about jazz and big band, and the guitar player in Bill Haley's Comets was a jazz guy, and he, if you listen to the famous guitar solo from Rock Around the Clock, it actually is a jazz solo. It doesn't sound anything like what we would think of as rock and roll. And of course, let's talk about the drums. The drummer on Rock Around the Clock was a guy named Billy Gussick, and he's not very well known today, but he was a swing-style drummer in the style of Gene Krupa. And when the band came in to record Rock Around the Clock, he just laid down kind of a swing-style thing with some little fills and little crashes. But when you put all this together, what you get is something totally unique, different, new, and revolutionary, which was the power and the drive of what was going to become rock and roll. So Bill Haley and His Comets, Rock Around the Clock, when it was first released, actually didn't do too well, but in 1956, 2 years later, it was used as the theme in a teenage juvenile delinquent movie called The Blackboard Jungle. And this movie, again, it was trying to show how juvenile delinquency was a bad thing, and if you're a kid, how you shouldn't be this way. But of course, it was so cool because it had this cool music in it, and it had all these cool juvenile delinquency kids in it, that teenagers rushed to see this movie.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. Put your glad rags on. Join me home. We'll have some fun when the clock strikes 1. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. We're gonna rock till the rock.
Some of them would camp out all day in the movie theaters so they could dance to this very cool song called Rock Around the Clock. So Rock Around the Clock really brought rock and roll to the masses and helped to cement the style rock and roll, okay? Now, at the same time as you had Rock Around the Clock, you had other artists, black artists, rhythm and blues artists like Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, Little Richard, and they were also writing music that appealed to this new demographic known as the teenager. Now, this was all very revolutionary because teenagers at this point really didn't have the chance to be teenagers the way we think of teenagers today. Kids often just had to go right from school to work. Sometimes they, poor immigrant families, they couldn't afford to have free time, to have money. There was no such thing as playing video games and going to the mall back in this time period. But in the 1950s, after World War II, kids could sort of be kids, and the term teenager became popular. So now kids have a little bit of money, they got some free time, they start writing records for kids, and that's what rock and roll is. It was music that was made for teenagers. So, all these things come together and start taking off, and we have rock and roll. Now, from a drumming perspective, a couple of cool things happened during this time period. First of all, we had talked back when we spoke about rhythm and blues as the primary groove of a rhythm and blues player was the shuffle, right? Well, now, as we move into the 1950s, this shuffle gets more and more frenetic. So instead of it being dun 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 dun, it kind of goes dun 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 and becomes more flattened out. And drummers like Earl Palmer, who was down in New Orleans and playing for people like Little Richard and Fats Domino's, listening to this, and he starts taking his groove and going, instead of da 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 da, he changes it, da 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 da. So now rock and roll as a drumming style starts to emerge and starts to get more beefed up. The fills get bigger, and now that we have a straight eighth groove, we start going da 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 da, bam, and they go back to 1 and they start hitting 1 harder, and now we start crashing our cymbals on beat 1. So that's another element of rock and roll drumming that starts to become part of what drummers were doing. And of course, all these artists have big hits, and rock and roll as a style evolves, and lots of drummers are listening. And now, for the first time, drummers in the late 50s start identifying themselves as rock and roll drummers for the first time ever. And so we really have now what we think of as a modern kind of a rock or a pop style of drumming. This is when it first emerged in the 1950s. Dig it. Who could tell me what made a drum set a drum set?
The low boy.
Kick pedal. Match grip.
The sock cymbal.
My name is Daniel Glass. I'm a drummer, author, and educator. In 1994, I joined a band called Royal Crown Revue. We were trying to figure out how to take the rebellious spirit of modern styles like punk and put it into big band and other roots music. We found out it was already there. I've been absorbed in this world ever since. I started researching the evolution of the drum set and the way that we play it. In the last dozen years, I've interviewed more than 60 different legendary drummers. I came to a startling conclusion. Perhaps more than any other instrument, the drum set is equipped to tell the story of America and American music.
All of these immigrants coming from around the world brought their technology. Jazz music and pop music were one and the same. You could dance to it.